Patrick McGinnis, Tasha Amy, Marion Horwell, Susan McClave, Richard Hayter, Eric Sandvik, Tom Goman, Aaron O'Leary, and Allison Litzenberger. These are the names of the people who walked up into the wilderness of Mount Hood one weekend in May 1986 and sadly never returned. Hi, my name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid, the channel where we explore all things that are at least a little bit dark, from deadly diseases to natural disasters, from true crime to man-made catastrophes. So if that's your kind of thing, come along and let's get morbid. On May 11th, 1986, which just so happened to be Mother's Day, 15 students and a few adults met up at their school in Portland just before midnight. They were all about to embark on a 6-mile climb to the top of Mount Hood and back. The climb was a mandatory experience that all 10th graders at the religious private school, Oregon Episcopal School, had to participate in. The students were split up into 4 groups. The purpose of the trip was to teach students leadership, problem solving, and teamwork. And for months before the trip, students were taught climbing skills so that they would be prepared when the time came. No matter which route you take on Mount Hood, it's what is called a technical climb, which requires equipment and training. Equipment includes crampons, ropes, ice axes, and the like. It is also a dangerous climb. Dozens of people are known to have died on Mount Hood since 1896. People have been killed by avalanches, from falling, being crushed by massive chunks of ice, or falling into crevasses. People have simply vanished, never to be seen again, and for their bodies to never be recovered. But after falling, the most common cause of death on Mount Hood is exposure, more specifically, hypothermia. Once everyone was at the school and they were all ready, they got onto a bus that would bring them to the lodge Timberline on the mountain. Alongside the students were several adults who were also going on the trip. Tom Goman, who was an Episcopal priest and the chaplain at the school, Sharon Spray, who was the mother of Hillary, one of the students, Dee Zduniak, an Outward Bound instructor, and Ralph Summers. There were 20 people who were going on the trip, and by the end of it, almost half, 7 students and 2 adults, would be dead. It is the second deadliest alpine disaster in American history. I want to jump in here and ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. I'm trying to make this channel my full-time job so that I can bring you more morbid topics. I'm only at 168 subscribers, so if you're morbid like me, help me get there by hitting subscribe now. Okay, let's get back to the video. They left the lodge at around 3 in the morning and headed out onto the mountain. It took some effort right out of the gate as there was at least a foot of snow on the ground, and anyone who has grown up in an area with a lot of snow knows how tiring walking through snow without snowshoes can be. The Timberline Lodge may look familiar to some people. Although it is well known that the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, inspired the book The Shining by Stephen King, it was Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood that was actually used for the exterior shots in the Stanley Kubrick film, The Shining. Side note, I am a huge Stephen King fan. I am an even bigger Stephen King movie fan. I own at least 60 Stephen King movies, and I keep them in their own cabinet, and I have them organized by release date. But I absolutely hate Stanley Kubrick's The Shining with a passion. I especially hated the ending because it just totally missed the point, but I digress. If you thought that the Timberline Lodge looked familiar to you, that's probably because it is. Anyway, Tom Goman, the leader of the program, was a very intelligent man with a theology degree from Harvard and many science degrees, which included physics and chemistry, among more advanced sciences. He also had a lot of experience mountain climbing, but had started showing signs of recklessness prior to the trip. A former student recalled a stunt on a prior training trip where he took a swan dive off the side of a cliff with inexperienced students holding the rope as his only lifeline. He was bloodied and bruised, and all of the students were very disturbed by the experience. And his recklessness would continue on into his final trip. The afternoon before everyone was set to go off on the climb, the weather reports predicted dangerous and nasty weather, which should have prompted Tom to call off the trip. But, for reasons unknown, he didn't. Now, before I go any further, I would like to say I don't want to demonize him. Although his choice to continue the trip ended in tragedy, I don't believe that it was necessarily intentional. I believe it was just foolish recklessness. Why? Because everyone said that he was a beloved teacher, and pretty much everyone liked him. The former student who talked about the cliff dive also remarked that he loved him like a father, and as he got to know him more, though, he realized that he was a pretty troubled person. The first several hours of the trip, the weather had been pretty good, considering, but as the sun came up, Hillary Spray started complaining of a stomach ache. So, not wanting to push herself, Hillary and her mother decided to turn back around and head back down on the mountain. This saved their lives. When the group reached a warming hut at 7,000 feet elevation, 2 more students decided to turn back. A few hours later, 2 more students bailed. And soon after, Dee, the outward bound instructor, was experiencing snow blindness, and she decided that she too would head back down. That meant that the group was now down to 13 people. Within 2 hours of the last person turning back, the weather turned with a vengeance. But Tom Goman urged everyone to keep going, telling them all that they could still reach the summit if they just kept going. It was only at 2 p.m., hours after they should have already reached the summit, that the professional guide, Ralph Summers, finally convinced Tom Goman that it was too dangerous for them to keep going, and that it was time for them to call it. They needed to go back down. They were 11,000 feet up the mountain, and unfortunately, they didn't realize that it was already too late. Around an hour and a half later, after they began their return, the youngest student, Patrick McGinnis, began showing symptoms of hypothermia. He didn't have the body fat to insulate him. He had slurred speech, trouble maintaining his balance, and started expressing a wish to lay down and get some sleep. The weather was just getting worse and worse, and they could only see 20 to 30 feet ahead of themselves. But they decided to try to warm the boy up. So they helped him climb inside of a sleeping bag, and then a senior, Susan McClave, took off her snow gear and climbed inside the sleeping bag with him, with the hope that her body would warm him up. Ralph Summers was able to get a camp stove going in spite of the wind and snow, and was able to heat up some water. He added candy to it for carbs. Carbs are essential for energy. A person participating in mountain climbing burns 500 plus calories an hour. So carbs are very important for maintaining energy and also maintaining body heat. It was an hour before the group was able to get going again. Unfortunately, as they began again, Tom Goman tried to calculate a new route that would allow them to avoid a canyon, that it would have just added to their struggle. It's not known whether his cognitive abilities were affected or not, but he miscalculated, and they set off on a route that was 20 degrees off course. Now, if it was a small difference, it may not have been as dire a mistake, but the further they went, the further off course they got. With the whiteout conditions, they had no idea that they were actually walking sideways on the mountain and not down. It was a deadly mistake. They continued on even as visibility dropped to 10 feet, but after Ralph Summers, who was the acting guide, was able to lead the group past one crevasse before almost falling into another one, at that point he realized it was far too dangerous to keep going and that they should probably just dig in and wait out the storm, or at least the worst of the storm. They dug a little snow fort, or a cave, and they climbed inside. Since they should have already arrived back at the lodge, alarms went up and Portland Mountain Rescue, which is a rescue group, assembled at the lodge ready to head out even as the storm raged on. One of the members of the group recalled years later that the weather that day was the worst in his 17 years of experience. And at the time that the rescue group headed out, the winds were over 100 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of a Category 2 hurricane. By this time, at least 4 feet of snow had fallen on the mountain. Throughout the day, more rescue teams joined in on the search for the climbing group, but it was to no avail. Not one of the many teams would be able to find the group. Back to the group. The cave that Summers made with some assistance measured 6 feet by 8 feet wide and was 4 feet high. It became a nightmare. It should have been a haven, a place to wait out the storm, but it was not nearly big enough to fit everyone. There were 13 of them, and when they tried, the body heat emanating from everyone caused the walls to begin to melt, causing a puddle of ice-cold water to accumulate at the bottom of the cave. People felt like they weren't able to get a breath in, either, causing them to feel panicked. The best idea that any of them were able to come up with was that they would all have to take turns. Some of the people would stay outside of the cave for a few hours before switching out and getting to take a turn inside the snow cave. At the same time, the group struggled to keep the mouth of the cave open as the snow continued to fall. As the sun came up on Tuesday morning, Ralph Summers realized that Tom Goman's condition was becoming critical, among others. He decided that their only chance to survive was if he were to leave the group and head down in hopes that he'd be able to guide rescuers back to them. When he was asked if there was anyone else who wanted to go with him, an older student, Molly Shula, said that she would. It was a risky choice, but so was staying. Risk going out and getting lost, or risk freezing to death? Turns out that Ralph Summers and Molly Shula picked the right option. Even though when they set out they were still on the wrong path, they were incredibly lucky to stumble upon another lodge just a few hours after walking. Although they were a couple miles away from the Timberline Lodge, they were saved. It was Tuesday night when 3 more students decided to leave the cave. Allison Litzenberger, Aaron O'Leary, and Eric Sandvik. The students were able to dig themselves out, but at this point, the cave became completely sealed again, and they couldn't get back in. But this meant that 8 people were stuck inside the cave. On Wednesday morning, the storm finally passed, and as visibility returned, a team of rescuers were actually able to see far in the distance, and they saw a couple of black dots, which they knew had to be people. When the rescue team finally reached them, they found the bodies of Allison Litzenberger and Aaron O'Leary. They were both in the fetal position in a futile attempt to stay warm. Not long after, a separate rescue team found Eric Sandvik, the 3rd person who left the cave. He didn't move far from the cave before seemingly giving up. It wasn't long before he died of exposure. But the rescue group that found Eric didn't know exactly where the buried snow cave was. It was heartbreaking as somehow it was conveyed to the waiting and anxious parents of the students that 3 students had been found. It hadn't been clearly communicated that the found students were in fact deceased. I cannot imagine the absolute gut-wrenching agony it must have been for those parents when they learned that it hadn't been a miracle and that they would never see their children alive again. I just cannot imagine it. And that's how Wednesday ended. 3 students found dead, 8 people still missing on the mountain. The rescue team that had found Eric was sadly called to another area where Ralph Summers had thought that he had left the group. Unfortunately, we'll never be able to know if things had been different if they had been allowed to continue in that area searching. Thursday morning started with rescue groups searching higher up on the mountain and working their way down. For most of the day, the rescuers found nothing. Late in the afternoon, an experienced rescuer named Bagger was sure that they were searching far too high up on the mountain and located the area that he believed was their best bet for finding them. Even though others believed that the area had already been searched well enough, Bagger decided to get his own group along with Ralph Summers, and they went back to the area where they had found Eric Sandvik the day before, and they began stabbing the ground with avalanche poles, which are designed for locating people buried by avalanches. And just after 5:30 p.m. on Thursday, just half an hour before they were supposed to call it for the day, they finally found the cave. Suddenly, everyone began digging as fast as they could, knowing that every minute could count. They knew they'd found the right place when they began to smell something awful, but they could also hear something amazing, the sound of someone moaning, a sign of life. When they finally got into the cave, they discovered 6 dead bodies. But miraculously, they found 2 survivors, Giles Thompson and Brinton Clark. Both were very hypothermic and had a long journey still ahead of them. Thompson, when he arrived at the hospital, actually went into cardiac arrest. Fortunately, the doctors were able to revive him. He spent the next few months in the hospital, but as time went on, it was apparent that the mountain expedition would have a lifelong effect on him. The damage caused during his time in the cave was so extensive that after months of efforts to save his legs, the doctors were forced to amputate them to save his life. The damage had been just too great. An investigation later opened by the school determined that the cause of the tragedy was mostly the fault of Tom Goman, the leader of the group. They found that he failed in his responsibility to call off the trip when the storm was predicted to be severe, and failing to have the students turn back and return sooner. The insurance company used by the school offered the deceased students' families settlements for the school's part in the tragedy. But Patrick McGinnis's family was angry and went forward with a lawsuit against the school. Just 2 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, the McGinnis family settled with the school. The parents of Richard Hayter, another student who died in the cave, they also decided to sue the school, but they didn't back down and settle. They wanted Ralph Summers and the school to be held liable, although Ralph Summers wasn't found liable for any part in the tragedy, which makes sense as he was just a consultant and he had no real pull on the trip. The jury did find, however, that the school was negligent. Hayter's family was awarded $500,000, although they had sought almost $3 million in damages. I personally agree with the jury's verdict. The trip mandated for students, which to me is at least somewhat reckless considering that Mount Hood had killed over 150 people in the last 150 years. They also put the decision to call off the trip in the discretion of a single person. There probably should have been a committee to decide when a trip should be canceled or delayed. And they also employed Tom Goman. Although a beloved teacher and man, he did endanger the lives of over a dozen students, and his decisions led to the deaths of half of them. We will never understand why he thought that they should still press forward. Today, the Mount Hood disaster has been largely forgotten. But for those still associated with the Episcopal School of Oregon, every year in May, they have a memorial for those who never came back from the mountain. And to this day, the school has never held another climb on Mount Hood. And that's it for today. If you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe. To vote on an upcoming video's topic, see the community tab, and I'll see you in the next video. Malevolent Mycology, Poisonous Mushrooms, and Bad Trips. Be merry, but stay morbid.